So in the next chapter in Spengler, we have chapter 12, the state. This is the third of his 3 chapters on the state that we've already looked at the other 2. This is letter C, philosophy of politics. And so now Spengler begins to, in this chapter, he begins to go into his critique of democracy, what he thinks is wrong with it, and also his theory of the evolution of democracy itself. But he begins the chapter by stating that what he's going to do in this chapter is basically a physiognomy of politics as it has actually been practiced in the course of history, and not as we wish it would have been practiced, or not as the ideologue or the intellectual would want it to be practiced. So he's going back to his older opposition of the fact man, the statesman, versus the intellectual, the useless intellectual. And he always holds up the example of Plato's experiment in going to Syracuse to be the philosopher who advised Dionysius II in his political machinations there, and the utter disaster that resulted therefrom, as one of the primary exemplars of the fact that the truth man, no matter how great he is or influential in the realm of truths, and I think we can say that nobody was more influential in the history of truth than Plato. Really, without Plato, you don't have a history of philosophy at all, really. But even within that truth realm, a great mind like Plato can have little effect, he thinks, on the realm of actuality. I think he overstates and oversimplifies the case a bit, but the basic opposition does remain. The statesman is the fact man, and the philosopher is the truth man. And he says that politically gifted peoples do not exist. This is how he starts off the chapter. People, whether in a democracy, whether it's a mob, or whether it's in a nation under the influence of an aristocracy, is always ruled by a political minority, a ruling minority. There's always an elite in charge somewhere. So politically gifted peoples and groups do not exist. They're always a kind of group that has to be led by someone. And then he goes on to ask, and he says, how then is politics done? And he says that politics is always accomplished by a statesman, and the statesman is different from the man of theory in that he has an eye, he puts eye in quotes, an eye for actualities. He can look at a horse, for example, and take in at a glance how good it's going to do in the races. It's that kind of eye that he has. He has the sureness of instinct for political events, for the when of things. And he always works with existing historical forms as they are. When he comes on the field, he masters them. He says the way a Bach or a Mozart mastered the musical forms of his time, and does not feel the need to invent new ones or to modify existing ones in accordance with some pre-established plan by some intellectual world reformer interested in creating a utopian society. For Spengler, utopias do not exist. And so that's how politics is done. And he says that the politician, or the true statesman rather, is in the larger sense of the word an educator, but not an educator in morals or ideas, an educator by exemplary actions. So he sets up exemplary actions, and in doing so he creates a great tradition that is then followed by other men after him who seek to imitate the patterns and the archetypes that he has laid down. And this, I think, is very true. For example, if we think of Napoleon thought of himself as following in the footsteps of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, in turn, thought of himself as following in the footsteps of Alexander. Alexander in the footsteps of Miltiades, and so on. Hitler saw everything that he was doing as basically an imitation of the deeds of Frederick the Great. And on it goes. So the great statesman, according to Spengler, sets up the archetypes for action that other men after him will follow. And he says that a statesman, if he fails to create a great tradition, he can actualize and continue in this tradition that has been established by others. He says that, for example, Bismarck could not form a tradition, he only followed one, so he was somewhat of a flawed statesman. But the tradition is necessary, and if the tradition is set up, then great politics will take the place of the great politician. It's as though it sets up precedents that then take on their own course. And it's out of the strength of the tradition that is set up that politics then continues to shape itself. British politics, he says, is this way. The British politician has a tradition of confidence and a sureness of instinct that makes politics for him second nature. And it has nothing to do with truths or theories written about in books. The great statesman is the fact man. So this is what he starts off by saying in the chapter, and then he discusses then the evolution of politics. Briefly, he says, we recall that the evolution of politics within a civilization is that it begins with the estates, in the first estate, and really the only estate as far as he's concerned is the nobility. So politics moves from the estates to party politics, and then eventually to Caesarism. So we have in the time of the 5th century in Rome the rise of the tribunate in opposition to the patricians, to the Senate, and in those days the politics were still the work of estates. They were still class estates, full of instinct and blood and sureness of tradition. But by the time we get to 287 BC, we get the formation of parties. The optimates versus the populares become the new party politics. And from there, as party politics died down, it gradually will turn into the politics of Caesars, in which we have the strong individual with his own private following. And very often this will also include a private army, as in the case of Pompey or Marius or Caesar, all of whom were individuals who had their own private armies. And then we have the disintegration of intellect and money and the rise of force politics. So he says that the governing forces then in the megalopolitan stage, when democracy comes in, he identifies aristocracy with culture, and democracy with the form of politics that every civilization takes on in one way or another, some variation of democracy in the civilization phase, which lasts for about 2 centuries under the guise of party politics. And these party politics are governed not by blood and instinct, but sureness of instinct, and tradition, as in the case of the aristocratic phase of civilization, that is constitutive of the essence of the structure of the late Culture period. Before that it had been feudalism. The early Culture period is governed by feudalism, the late Culture period by aristocracy. It gives way to money and intellect. Money and intellect are the primary democratic ruling forms that govern the formation of democracy and the way in which it's practiced in a civilization's megalopolitan period. And then he goes on to say that he moves into a critique of democracy, wherein he says that democracy, though it espouses the rights of man, though it espouses freedom of the press and things of this nature, really, in reality, isn't. It's fundamentally governed by money, and money determines everything that happens in a democracy. Money determines not only who gets elected, who can be influenced by money, it also determines in courts of law who's going to be acquitted and isn't, as we well know today. And it also determines not freedom of the press, but who is going to form and shape public opinion in accordance with who owns these presses. And today this would be all the modern media, and this is these criticisms of democracy in the days in which he was writing were largely new criticisms. Now they're staples. Everyone agrees that O.J. Simpson would not have gotten his acquittal if he didn't have the money to buy his way out of it. Everybody knows that it takes millions of dollars for politicians to run an office now, and that what they're doing really is a charade of democracy, because by the time they win their elections they owe so much money to corporations and lobbyists who have put so much money into their pockets to change the laws and rules in their favor, that by the time they get into office they owe so many of these favors that really what they end up doing isn't democracy at all. It's a kind of a corporate plutocracy, a corporate hijacking of the government by corporate interests, and the democracy for the people, by the people, is of course a sham. I think those criticisms are good ones, and they hold still true, I think, to this day. And then his other critique, before getting to that, I did want to put in a footnote here about private armies. When he says that when party politics disintegrates, as it disintegrated in ancient Rome during the time of Caesar and Marius and Sulla, and these individuals have their own private followings, What they have to do is they have to pay and bribe people of high society to show up in the forum. Democracy was a process, was the manipulation of public opinion in the forum, consistent with classical man's Euclidean bodily there-ness. People had to show up, they had to be visible, and though there were laws against paying them to show up and support the individual, nonetheless, these oraticians and rhetors and demagogues did indeed pay individuals, bribe them in high society to show up in the forum and pretend that they were backing these individuals. And there would be all kinds of oratorical manipulation of the crowd in terms of conventions, the convention of fake sobbing, rending garments, fabricating lies about their opponents. Not much has changed. In modern democratic times, all these strategies are still there. But these were the conventions for manipulating the mob in one's favor. And it was all a matter of money and buying votes, and that has not changed. But the idea of the breakdown of democracy with the rise of the private following and the private army, where you can pay individuals to vote for you. You can basically buy votes. This has been true all along, of course. But you can also, in this period of time, due to the huge private fortunes of individuals like Caesar and Pompey, you can afford to hire your own private army. And the private army becomes the gateway into the force politics of Caesarism, because anyone who has the military force can then get and can eventually seize control of the government, basically, which is what happens in a Caesarism. And I think today's equivalent of this phenomenon, we can already see it coming in the phenomena of the private military security firm, Blackwater being the charismatic example. I think this is an ominous precedent. These kinds of security firms that can be hired, there's some constitutional questionability about them, and I think that who owns them may become an ominous precedent for the future of American politics in particular. We'll see what happens with them, but I see private security firms like Blackwater playing a larger and larger role in the political arena, which does indeed signify the shift away from ideas into zoological power struggles. Blackwater was hired not too long ago to clean up the pirate situation, the Somalian pirates. And if they are hired more and more to go and do these operations, I think we're going to see a Caesarism forming out of this. It's starting to become clear, I think, how this is going to take place. So I wanted to insert that footnote. And then, Spengler's point about democracy is that it's a sham, basically. It's all about money and intellect. But it's primarily about money, and the people who have the largest amounts of money are the ones who get to determine what happens. And nowhere is this more true than in the so-called vaunted freedom of the press that Spengler says is a joke. Freedom of the press is, of course, not freedom of the press, since the owners of the press, the William Randolph Hearsts, the Luces, the Northcliffes, the individuals who own the press are the ones who can determine public opinion. And he says here, he moves in the end of this chapter, into a discussion of media studies, and he comes the closest here that he ever comes in his writing, I think, to admitting that it is formations and transformations in the media that have melted down the Western mind, and that have contributed to the rise of illiteracy and disliteracy of the kind that was already becoming visible in Spengler's day, and which is glaringly evident in our day, and which has a lot to do with the decline of the Western mind. We sort of move into an antinomy here, and I've discussed this in other videos, in which we have to say, well, is the decline of the Western mind the result of media transformations that melt down the mental phase space that was created by the Gutenbergian galaxy? Spengler says in this chapter that the newspaper pushes the book, has pushed, by 1920 here when he wrote this, has pushed the book aside, and now the individual's opinion and what is true and what isn't true can be determined and shaped by the newspaper, which has a more attractive layout and attracts, and the masses can read it. And indeed, he says that compulsory education, even though it may have originated as an honest ideal during the Enlightenment, is, by the time of the 20th century, as democracy is beginning to disintegrate, is simply education to get people to read so that they can then read newspapers and be manipulated by the interests, those who own these newspapers, so that they can be manipulated. And it's very similar to, I think, in many respects, Spengler's essay here agrees in many respects with Adorno and Horkheimer's idea in the culture industry, that the culture industry is basically fascistic and manipulates the masses and gets them to believe what it wants them to believe, and shapes truth and public opinion simply by indoctrination. I think there's a surprising agreement there between Adorno and Spengler on this particular issue, one from the left, one from the right. So Spengler did not trust this. But this idea that the mind has been in process of being melted down